Okay, sorry about what happened in the previous clip. Um, okay, so now we continue with, I'm going to be talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson and providing a context for the reading of chapter one of Nature. Okay, so I mean, he is a figure that is really widely celebrated as an important um, such an important voice in the emergence of United States national culture, and nowadays is recognized as one of the great writers of what is known in literature the name of the American Renaissance. And this immense popularity he already enjoyed in his own lifetime was mainly due to the attraction that many of his fellow citizens felt for the liberal ideas he passionately propounded. He was so passionate about transmitting when he was transmitting his ideas. Still concerned about their intellectual dependence upon this European past, these new United States readers really welcome Emerson's proposal to construct a new culture based upon direct contact with nature, hoping that an unmediated approach to the beautiful scenery of their own country would set them free from any oppressive foreign domination. And such a proposal had the power to appeal both to their patriotic sentiments and to the then fashionable romantic attachment to the unspoiled natural world. So actually, the thoughts Emerson vehemently expressed about individualism and self-reliance found an extremely receptive audience in his homeland and really contributed to the shaping of some essential U.S. values. He was a preacher, Emerson, a lecturer, a poet, an essayist, and it's actually, as I'm saying, as I say in the previous video, he was probably the most influential of all U.S. writers of the 19th century. His outstanding moral ascendancy over people and his energetic character, he actively helped a number of his contemporary writers. He was a mentor through practical advice, personal connections, financial support many times, and editorial efforts. For example, Henry Thoreau was a case in point. I mean, the second edition of Leaves of Grass, also Walt Whitman printed the congratulatory letter Emerson had sent him and acknowledged the impact of his esteemed master in his poetry when he remarked, quote, "I was shimmering, and Emerson brought me to a boil," unquote. It is fair to say that Emerson did not provide actually a consent to publish the letter, but anyway, Whitman did. Anyway, so apart from this immense influence on the works of many U.S. authors, Emerson's prestigious position also provided a stance for others to react against. And although his rise to fame eventually turned him into an imposing somehow figure for most people, he always represented himself as an experimenter, as a questioner, as a seeker, rather than a guide signaling the path for anyone to follow. And he was fully aware of his contradictions and did not even try to offer a truly organized body of thought. He stubbornly refused, like that. That's why they did not write a manifesto. He did not want to subscribe to any particular philosophical system. For years, Emerson has been addressed primarily as a proponent of the philosophical and literary movement that is called transcendentalism. And so in this context, it has been alternately contended that he was a great philosopher and that he was not a philosopher at all. In fact, his writings, each and every one, address philosophical issues and cannot be overlooked in any kind of analysis. But at present, the renewed critical appreciation which his work is enjoying tends to emphasize his genuine literary achievements rather than focus on his philosophical theories. For instance, has been convincingly argued that the maturation of his literary consciousness owes much to the stylistic innovations of the worn and vibrant image filled sermons preached by the popular evangelical minister that it was called Edward Thompson Taylor. And so, according to this view, the controversial, quote, Divinity School address would have actually achieved literary status because of Emerson's successful application of this type of inventing imaginary to the subversion of traditional forms. And the ideas expressed in Emerson's work have been praised by many and have been deprecated by many others. And so I am actually very curious to see what's your point on him. Let's see. Well, a little bit about his biography. He was born in Boston, and he was the son and the grandson of ministers. And he had really strong religious beliefs, and however, he was traced to his mother, a firm believer who led a deeply religious life inspired by different trends within Christianity. For example, his mom was very felt a lot of affinity towards Quakers. And also, well, a very important figure is his eccentric paternal aunt, Mary Moody Emerson. She was a self-educating writer and was an outspoken controversialist who was interested in a wide range of subjects, including theology, literature, natural history. And then his father was also a very important figure for him. He was the Reverend William Emerson, who he was a Unitarian minister of the First Church of Boston. And his father died when he was only 8 years old. That left not only a big impact, but left an impoverished family. No money. So in 1812, at the age of 9, Emerson was sent to Boston Public Latin School, and at the age of 14, was sent to Harvard, where he received a very solid liberal education, and he met his expenses by working. And then he graduated from Harvard College at the age of 18. And he did not have a distinguished record because he preferred to read what he liked rather than what he was assigned. And so after graduation, Emerson became, in his own words, a hopeless schoolmaster, unquote, because he was unable to impose his authority on his pupils. So he abandoned teaching. And in 1925, he entered Harvard Divinity School to study theology. I have to say that for him, he did not believe in imposing. That's why he had this problem with authority. And then he began preaching. And he was actually ordained as junior pastor of Boston's Second Unitarian School. But actually, U.S. Unitarianism broke very sharply with Calvinism. And then the term Unitarianism comes from the rejection of the Trinitarian doctrine, according to which God is identified as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So Unitarians believe that Jesus was sent by God to accomplish the divine mission of helping humanity through a series of moral teachings, but was not a God. And they also rejected the Calvinist tenets of innate depravity and predestination. And instead, Unitarians believe in the essential goodness and perfectibility of human nature. That's very Quarkish. And also believed in salvation extended to everyone, not restricted to only a few elected by grace. So consequently, sorry. So as I was saying, consequently, they replaced the fear and anxiety which Calvinist doctrines generated in most believers by an optimistic and confident attitude, which suited Emerson's cheerful, energetic temperament. And well, he married Ellen Tucker, who actually died of tuberculosis 15 months later at the age of 19, because he first married when he was 18. And actually, as you may imagine, his wife death really left him in a state of deep psychological, intellectual, and spiritual crisis. And about this time, his faith began to waver, and under the influence of certain German philosophers. And then he developed his skepticism towards Christianity, and had increasingly trouble accepting the authority of the Bible. So, having analyzed his own emotions, he reached the conclusion that the individual religious experiences of each person were much more important than the dogma and ritual of religious institutions. That's also very Quaker. So, in 1831, Emerson notified the Second Unitarian Church of Boston that he could no longer administer the Lord's Supper, the sacrament of communion, because he no longer believed in its validity. So actually, he resigned from the ministry a few months later, and although he continued to preach in Unitarian pulpits, he was much more interested in the Quakers, and who hold meetings at which everyone sits in silence, waiting for the inner voice. And so, under the Quakers' influence, Emerson would advocate periods of solitude as to listen in quiet reflection in order to recognize the voice of God within each person. So, actually, in 1833, he went on a 10-month European tour, and he visited Malta, Sicily, Naples, Rome, Florence, Paris, and London, Spain. And while in Paris at the Jardin des Plantes, he had an epiphany, a sort of vision of the mystical correspondence between man and the forms of nature. That was in Paris, which would later inspire much of his work. And apart from that intense experience, the most significant results of his journey were the acquaintance he made with William Wordsworth, John Stuart Mill, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I mean, the celebrities of the time and the promoters of the Romantic movement. So, and he also met the British historian and SS Thomas Carlyle in Scotland, and they became lifelong friends and helped each other to publish and create an audience. And then he went back to United States, and then he settled in rural Concord, where many of his ancestors had lived. The inheritance from his first wife enabled him to buy a house, and also provided him with an annual income. And so, thanks to this legacy, he did not need a steady job, and he spent his life reading, writing, preaching, and lecturing. And then, a year later, he remarried Lydia, whom he called Lydian Jackson, and had 4 children. And so Emerson's first book, Nature, was anonymously published in Boston in 1836, and it was favorably received by critics both in the United States and in England. It initially received little support from the general public. For its composition, the author drew his inspiration from an eclectic amalgam of different cosmopolitan sources, including Romanticism and the writings of the Swedish philosopher Emanuel Swedenborg. So Nature showed the influence of idealistic philosophies and manifested a way of thinking, which would be labeled transcendentalism. Because actually Emerson credited himself, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, with the invention of the term, quote, transcendental, to describe the idealism of his time, in opposition to the empirism of Locke, for example. So actually Locke held that all knowledge other than deductive reasoning must be based on sensory experience. So actually he regarded that the mind of a person at birth, remember, is a tabula rasa upon which experience imprinted knowledge, whereas Kant believed that they were ideas or forms which did not come by experience, but they were intuitions of the mind itself. And he called them transcendental forms. That's why then the movement was characterized as that, coming from this idea from Kant, and that Emerson himself credits that. So, Nature, 95 pages, has really become the founding document of, or the manifesto of the Symposium of Friends, who would be known at first with a certain degree of um, doubt by the name of Transcendental Club. And it had a small membership composed mainly of Unitarian ministers, loosely bound together as a religious reform movement within the Unitarian Church. And during the 4 years that it lasted, the society met 30 times for the free discussion of theological and moral subjects. And the members of the club were dissatisfied with the contemporary US establishment and considered themselves as the renewers of a spiritual life, where most conservatives regarded transcendentalism as a dangerous to the church and dangerous to all forms of organized religion and even to society in general. So transcendentalists wanted actually to transcend the limits imposed by tradition, that's for sure, and by placing each other person trust in one's own inner voice rather than in society, because they held that truth is inside each individual person. New England transcendentalism. So as you can see, that is very much Eastern, aligns with a lot of Eastern worldviews, right? So New England transcendentalism flourished between 1836 and 1847, and really strongly conditioned the intellectual atmosphere of the country, at least until the Civil War. And really remains a very persistent thread in US thought, right? This connection with nature and the reflection of the divine. And in 1837, Emerson delivered the lecture titled An American Scholar at Harvard College. In it, he expressed some of his practical aspects of transcendentalism, where he applied his theoretical principles. And he encouraged young United States citizens to free themselves from dependency of an all-European model, and to be confident in their abilities to experiment and create their own civilization rather than to rely on European traditions and values. And so Emerson's pronouncements on the scholarship inspire really a radical reform in the US educational system. For example, elective courses rather than a prescribed curriculum for all undergraduates, this idea. And so the following year, Emerson delivered an extremely controversial address that I mentioned before on the state of Christianity to the Harvard Divinity School graduate. And his major thesis was that truth cannot be presented as a group of conventional doctrines or creeds because it cannot be received at second hand, he said. He also deplored the defects of historical Christianity and openly questioned the authority of established religious institutions. So this famous Divinity School address received, as you may imagine, a series of very virulent attacks as heresy, as blasphemy, and that's the reason why he was completely banned from speaking at Harvard for almost 30 years. In 1866, he was welcomed back to Harvard and given an honorary doctorate for 30 years. Actually, he was elected to the university board of overseers and became an active member of the committee that was in charge of modernizing the curriculum at Harvard. So going back to the transcendentalist influential quarterly journal, The Dial, Emerson regularly contributed here to this journal, and he actually edited from 1842 till 1844. And that also became a platform to talk. They were so committed, all the transcendentalists, to progressive social reform efforts. And however, he was reluctant to submit himself to the structure involved in any organized movement because he feared institutionalized prescriptions would compromise the independence of individual members. I mean, and that is so true even today, right? And so in the 1850s, as he was convinced that slavery was above all a moral wrong, he became a fervent advocate of abolitionism at a time when only 1/6 of the U.S. population when about 1/6 of the population were slaves, and delivered many anti-slavery addresses, speaking in defense of the famous. There was a famous European descendant abolitionist, John Brown, and also against the fugitive slave law that persecuted runaway slaves in the northern colonies. I mean, states. So, and apart from his substantial contributions to the anti-slavery movement, he also became a champion to the Native Americans by supporting the Cherokee Nation's refusal to leave their lands. And he also took a leading role in lobbying for the cause of women's rights. So he was very committed to the equality on heaven and earth. And so in the late 1860s, Emerson was at the height of his career as a lecturer. And by the 1820s, however, he began to suffer lapses of memory, and he retired in 1871. And so after part of his house was damaged by fire, his friends raised a sum of money to pay both for the repairs, and Emerson and his daughter to travel to England, France, Italy, and Egypt while the repairs were being undertaken. So imagine how popular and loved he was. He died in 1882 out of pneumonia, and he actually caught after a rain-soaked walk through his beloved woods. And Emerson really wrote poetry throughout his life, and although he had doubts about his merit as a poet, he considered himself a genuine poet. He would say, "I am born a poet, a low class without doubt, but yet a poet." He wrote in his future second wife. He wrote to a letter to his future second wife. And so he really struggled to break out. Sorry. He really, he was always searching for a new flexible style, and so he struggled to break out. Of the rigid forms that had characterized poetry, and he liked to experiment with irregularities in rhythm, rhyme, and line length. In terms of poetry, he has all these quatrains and very long poems, but his favorite themes, also in poetry, were a fusion of the everyday and what he considered to be these universal truths, because he thought that simple images of ordinary life were the most powerful to convey general ideas. And so he always gave priority to content over formal aspects, and he often sacrificed music to meaning. And actually, today, Emerson is not so much recognized as a poet, but as an essayist. And collected mostly his fame really mainly rests on the essays collected in the volumes that is called Such Essays, published in 1841. And then Essays second series in 1844. And when we talk about these essays, most of them were originally written as lectures to be delivered to a public audience in Boston or in his tours around the country. So Nature is really regarded Emerson's most original work, has an introduction and has 8 chapters. The first one is called Nature, the second Commodity, the third Beauty, the fourth Language, fifth Discipline, 6 Idealism, 7 Spirit, 8 Prospects, Because it is such a long essay, we will only read the introduction and the first chapter, because most of the major ideas of the work are outlined. And in particular, Emerson here articulates his philosophy of nature as the embodiment of this divine law. And in order to appreciate the extent to which he deliberately practiced the art of um, um, passionately transmitting, this is an amazing test actually to read aloud. Well, I'm just going to finish just reading a little bit from the introduction. He started with a quote from Plotinus, and okay, Plotinus was a new Platonist philosopher from the 3rd century. And the quote says, "Nature is but an image or imitation of wisdom, the last thing of the soul. Nature being a thing which does only do but not know." Introduction. Our age is retrospective. It builds the scriptures of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy our original revelation to the universe? Why should not? Why should? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy and insight and not of tradition and religion of revelation? Okay. And then from chapter 1 says, to go into solitude, a man needs to retire as much from his chamber as from society. A man not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me. But if a man would be alone, let him look at the stars. The rays that come from those heavenly worlds will separate between him and what he touches. One might think the atmosphere was made transparent with this design to give man in the heavenly bodies the perpetual presence of the sublime. Seen in the streets of cities, how great they are! If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God, which had been shown? The stars awaken a certain reverence because though almost present, they are inaccessible. Okay, well, that's all for my brief introduction on Emerson's nature. I hope you enjoyed the introduction and chapter 1.